Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Sabah Carrim about her novel Humeirah. In this part, we discuss the relationship between tradition and other cultural influences, and the way that Sabah's academic research into genocide has influenced her outlook and approach as a writer. If you haven't yet listened to the first part, I suggest you check that out first. And if you're enjoying our conversation, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Welcome back to my conversation with Sabah Carrim about her novel Humeirah. If you didn't catch the first part, please check that out first. We finished off talking in section one about some of the influences on Humeirah. We mentioned Nietzsche, for example. Her philosophical and cultural influences are quite eclectic. And at times that diversity seems to come into conflict with the insularity of the society she finds herself in. Yet we also see in her a kind of longing for community and connection. Do you think the desire for individual development, whether intellectual or spiritual, that we see in her character, can that exist comfortably alongside a culture that holds very tightly to traditional roles and values?
I think it's a very difficult question because I think, again, I have seen different things happen when those dynamics are at play. You can have an individual who feels stifled and who doesn't have the space for expression, for exploration, for questioning, and therefore has no other choice but to leave and to create her own world, which is, I think, what is hinted at in Humeirah. But you also have individuals who are supported by the community they're in, and however traditional these societies, if the immediate environment, I'm talking about the nuclear setting, or we're talking of relatives who are closer to the individual, are open-minded or are open to this new manifestation in their family, in their house, and they find this person exciting, and they're egging her on to to discover the world, to discover her own pursuits, then I think that sort of symbiosis can be very healthy. That sort of like environment could actually be very symbiotic and healthy. So I don't think there is a clear-cut answer to what you just said. I really just think it depends on each person's influence. Now, I will make a reference here to something that's, again, genocide related, because we spoke about Rwanda earlier. And since I'm a scholar in genocide studies, the immediate reference I think of is the Yazidi community, that was persecuted under Saddam Hussein and who were the direct victims of ISIS. I remember reading this book recently by Nadia Murad called The Last Girl. And in this book, we learned that it was a small community and they were very conservative in their values. They expected their girls to be brought up very conservatively, their women to be virgins at the time of their marriage. And ultimately what happened was, when these girls were abducted by members of the ISIS and raped and subjected to abuse, the ISIS perpetrators blackmailed them and said, I don't think you want to return to your society, because if you do, your society of Yazidi people is going to reject you because you're no longer a virgin and you've been a sex slave to us. And many of these women suffered that. But when they went back to their community, what I found amazing was how, because it was a small community, because it was led by, I think, people who had the foresight to look into this problem and realize that it needed a solution. These leaders of the community made a statement and said, look, whoever has been raped, whoever has been subjected to sexual abuse will not be judged by the rest of the community. And I think that transformed these women. A lot of these women today are writers, they're activists, and many of them have stories about resilience. So that statement by that leader of that community empowered them. These
mm,
women did not, for instance, after being subjected to abuse, have to come back to society and be, doubly persecuted. On the contrary, they were empowered.
mm,
Do we have leaders of other communities in the world who make these statements and who change the way people feel? I think not always. I think not often enough. And what happens then is that these victims are forced to then go through another process of trauma to
mm,
strengthen themselves and to walk out, which, as we all know today, I mean, if we want to bring in neuroscience,
mm,
we know the larger psychological and neuroscientific effects of being a recluse, of being excluded from society and community. And the damage is consequent. So
mm,
I think we need to speak about how, you know, many communities don't give room, don't provide room, don't give space to women. We're speaking about women here, we're speaking about Humeirah, but of any kind of victims actually to be redeemed through their own laws and their own edicts within the society. And I think we
mm,
need to take that very seriously whenever we think about the victims who come back or people who have been marginalized in any way.
mm. That's a fascinating example and a positive one, which is good to hear, even if we hear these things too rarely. We'll come back later to your scholarship on genocide and just maybe to finish off. Um, Staying with the novel for now, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about the form and how you put it together. So many parts of the novel, we have access to Humeira's internal thoughts, and as we've just seen, her thinking is clearly influenced by a wide range of sources, thinkers, etc. There seem to be times though when she struggles to apply them to her situation, particularly to like the everyday. So what do you think the novel has to say? Maybe what do you have to say about the uses of philosophy, of kind of abstract thought, and these big picture questions in everyday life, in the quotidian, let's say?
I think we've already, I mean, speaking about this specific topic is pretty hackneyed by now. And it forms a fundamental of so many philosophers in the simple proposition that there is a limitation to any kind of rationalization. I mean, we know, for instance, the limitations of, if we have to become academic here, we know the limitations of rational choice theory. People don't actually, when we want to find out what would someone do if they were, what would a member state do if it was attacked? And we try to apply rational choice theory. These are
Mm,
the rational choices it has, and this is what they might possibly do. And then we realize none of it works because people don't, or member states also, the governors don't really act in a very rational way all the
mm,
time. So I think at the base of laying out all these philosophies or these thoughts that Humeirah reads about, and then she tries to adapt them to her life, and then she realizes that she can't apply most of them to her life. It's just a hint, or it's a reference to the truism that no matter how we may rationally think of a problem and reach certain rational conclusions about it, I don't think it's easy to just follow them because we are not, most of the time, rational creatures
mm,
like to think we are. So just this debate, which, I mean, to go back to Nietzsche, because I think Nietzsche is referenced many times in Humeirah, the debate of Apollo and Dionysus, which formed the basis of that thought in my novel, was relevant to this conversation we're having right now
mm.
about the limitations of reason.
Yeah, I think that's something the novel captures really nicely. Is Humera is somebody who reads extensively, reflects on these things. As people in, say, the academic world do, people simply who just read widely. Yet, when you're in the situation yourself, it's not so simple as being able to apply these lessons. You're caught up in this kind of constant whirl of events and emotions that somehow you can't see as clearly as you think you should be able to. And I think that's something definitely that comes through. Yeah.
And I think anybody reading the novel would think, you are a woman, you do have some measure of freedom. Why don't you leave? But
mm,
is it easy to leave, to just walk out of a marriage, to leave a child behind,
mm,
to leave a community behind? And if you do, where do you go? And
mm.
all of these practical questions are there. Uh, but and that is the struggle that she goes through, as do many other women in many other societies that are more progressive, more traditional than the one that's depicted in the novel.
Yeah. And we touched on trauma a little earlier, and the novel ends with a tragic event, and I generally try to avoid big spoilers, so I won't say anything more than that. But I felt reading it that there were suggestions that sort of patterns of suffering might repeat themselves, and this is quite a traumatic structure. Um, Going back to the idea of misfit, and we just sort of had this question of why doesn't Humera escape? Um, I guess, yeah, how much would you say trauma is present in the novel, and how much of a determining factor is it, in terms of creating patterns of repetition? Um, I think there's a fascinating interplay between like individual trauma, how an individual experiences and re-experiences suffering, and collective trauma. And sometimes these two things seem to be conflated, but they must be very different, I think. So could you speak a little bit about how those play out in the novel as well?
Um, when you speak about collective trauma
Mm.
in the novel, I'm wondering here, um, what you mean exactly by collective trauma.
Yeah, so I was going off on a bit of a tangent perhaps there. I'm not sure collective trauma is present in the novel. There are accounts, for example, of places where a disaster has happened, and there seems to be an effect on the social bonds of that particular group that seems to mirror the kind of damage done to an individual, but it must be, a different process. I'm not sure that kind of trauma. Well, I don't think it is present in Humeira, actually, the novel. But in the sort of repetition of kind of structures of suffering we see with mother and daughter, for example, there's a kind of echo of, let's say, traumatic repetition. Is it trauma? Is it something else? Is that kind of comparison helpful, or is it actually misleading, do you think?
No, I think you're on point. I mean, when I, for instance, created or came up with the character of Warisa, the daughter of Humeira, I think I wanted to present a mini version of Humeira.
Mm,
You know, if you look into Warisa and even her own troubles, her own conflicts as a very young girl, it's not difficult to find that, to conclude that Humaira was probably her when she was a child, and she probably had the same sort of inner conflicts even growing up as a child, and couldn't understand many things around her, and had, whereas the disconnection between Gibran, the father of Humaira, and Humaira is very clear. I think the
mm,
disconnection between Humaira and Warisa is also very clear. Now, I think I wanted to present that sort of character because I think I was heavily influenced by the novel by James Joyce called A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where I think James Joyce lays down in so many detail what that sort of curious young person would be and the sort of questions that this person would have growing up
mm,
around at their environment, wondering what adults are about, what it would be like to be an adult, and having all these existential questions, even at a
mm,
very. And Warisa, the daughter of Humaira, has those questions, and that is what I wanted to do. And I think while Humaira is not, I would say, the most sympathetic character,
mm,
Warisa is because of the youth and everything else. Now, I thought about this very strategically. I didn't want to present Humaira as the most sympathetic character and Heather, her husband, as the villain in the story because I would
mm,
be very. So I made sure that I presented a complex not complex, but a complicated picture of the main character of Humeirah, so that everything was diverted
Mm.
towards one side in terms of just having a sympathetic character.
Yeah. And to finish off, then, could we come back to your academic research? So you're a specialist in genocide studies. Um, that's in itself obviously a huge area that we can't possibly cover in, comprehensively in this talk. But could you say a little bit about maybe how your research influences your general outlook? Does it, did it influence the way you wrote Humeirah, or these kind of quite separate things? Yeah, in what ways, maybe directly or indirectly, does that come into your writing of fiction?
Well, I mean, we're creative people, and I don't think we are the only ones who are creative. People in general are creative. And I think somehow or the other, when we do many things, we'll always figure out a way to make connections between the different things we do. And I think while I was not a genocide studies scholar at the time I was writing Humeirah,
Mm.
but I am now after many years, I would say that there are certain themes that have stayed, that have dominated my thinking, that are constants in my thought process. And one of them is, as I think I mentioned earlier, just the fact of how we should be careful about, being ethnocentric or harboring ethnocentric feelings, because this means that we are passive aggressive towards, other communities who we believe are, less superior to us or who are inferior to us, to put it more directly. And every time there's been genocide in a society or there's been mass atrocity, there is always evidence, if you go through the literature produced by different novelists or the art produced by different artists, there's always evidence of some kind of hatred directed towards another community, or an indication that one community thought it was better than the other. And sometimes people within that community don't think it's a big deal, don't
Mm.
think that it might lead to something violent or genocidal. And yet, you never know. You don't even have a control over that. I mean, even in terms of genocide studies, many of us have come up with different ways of finding out when there's going to be genocide, and we've come up with different measures. We've come up with various theories, but none of these theories, none of these measurements are actually very reliable, because
Mm.
there's so much of subjectivity involved in all of these measures, these measurements. So having said that, the experience of even Rwanda, where, as I talked about, I talked about the Tutsi and the Hutus, there was a history of resentment that existed between these two communities, where
Mm.
one community was made to feel that it was better than the other. And then that just spilled over one day, and there was 100-day long genocide in that community, in that country.
Mm.
And people still look back and can't believe that something so terrible happened, so egregious happened in that
Mm.
short time. 800,000 people were killed, which is 3 times worse than what happened in that same sort of period. If you compare it to the Holocaust, it's 3 times more people killed, and so it's not something we can overlook. And I think these thoughts dominate my mind a lot. I'm not saying that whatever I've talked about is necessarily going to erupt in violence. I think that's the reason why we study genocide, why there is such a thing called genocide studies, because we also speak about mechanisms to prevent violence whenever
Mm.
we feel that there is a difference, or that there are differences between communities, or some communities feel that they're better than others. We speak about genocide prevention. So we speak about the prevention of violence. We speak about education, about exposure, about memorialization. These are all the measures we speak about to try to stop the possibility of future violence. So I don't think this is something we should ignore,
Mm.
because while there are people within the community who are open-minded, who are not that insular, and who actually have an outward look, let's just say, on
Mm.
themselves and their lives and the upbringing of their children, I think there are many people within the community who still have that insular uh, thinking about who they are and about their superiority and why they should marry among themselves. So
Mm,
I think we have to find ways to control that. And I think my book is, or my writing is, comes as close as possible to exposing the inherent passive aggressive uh, sentiment directed towards other communities.
mm,
And my novel is not meant to be, as one writer, a Mauritian writer, when she was criticized for her writing, said, "We writers are not here to produce books on tourism, to speak
mm,
about, to extol the virtues of our countries. We are here to speak about the problems and the conflicts within our communities." And
mm,
that is, I think, I was trying to do.
mm.
And so my project, or um, my longing to write, my desire or my ambition to write fiction remains to dig uh, into problems and to lay them out
Mm.
as justifiably as I can.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting to hear those connections. And yeah, a topic of great importance and, I think ongoing urgency, of course, as well. Yeah. So
Thank you.
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for your answers about the novel. We will come back for part three, and I'm looking forward to hearing your recommendations for any kind of related texts that people might be interested in. So please do join us for part three.